Dear Father, I've been diagnosed with CJD, also known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. They tell me I have less than 3 months. It's time I met my son. Please call me at the office. Annie. Molly read Annie's letter. She gave a deep sigh and said, "Oh my God, we're going to lose another child. What on earth did we do to deserve this?" John MacRae did not answer Molly. He started up the Auburn Roadster and drove to Annie's office. From the office, he placed a call to the MacRae cigar factory. Mary answered the call. John MacRae asked to speak with Annie. Annie told her father of the illness. In a few months, she would become bedridden. Annie said as the years went by, she deeply regretted ignoring her son. She wanted to see Vincent before she passed. John MacRae said, "I don't think that's a good idea, Annie. It would be best to let things go. Vincent has a good life now. I think he's found someone he's going to marry." Annie started sobbing and said, "Please, Father, many years ago I begged you to tell Vincent that I was dead. Now I'm begging you to bring him to me. I want to die in peace." With a sigh, John MacRae said, "I will bring Vincent to you, but he will have to be told about his father. There can be no more secrets in the MacRae family." Annie said, "Thank you, Father. Tell him the whole story." John MacRae said, "Yes, I will. We will all be in Milwaukee within the week." John and Molly MacRae drove to the train depot to check train schedules. Vince and Gina were in an embrace when John and Molly MacRae returned home. They released their embrace as John and Molly entered the parlor. John and Molly each had a distraught look. Vince said, "What's wrong, Grandfather? Was there bad news in that telegram?" John MacRae sat down and said, "Yes, grandson, very bad news. We all have to leave for Milwaukee in 2 days." Vince looked puzzled and said, "All? Me too? What about Gina?" John MacRae looked at Vince and Gina. He said, "The train stops in Chicago before Milwaukee. We can all ride together to Chicago. Gina, I'm very sorry about cutting your visit short, but a family emergency has come up that we must address. Please forgive me." Gina sensed the seriousness of the situation and said, "I understand, sir." John MacRae looked at Molly and said, "I have some things to go over with Vince. Why don't you and Gina drive into Deadwood? You can show her the dress shop and the Emporium. Afterwards, take Gina out for lunch. Take the Chrysler." Molly smiled slightly and said, "Okay, but I'd rather drive the Auburn. That Chrysler drives like a truck." After Molly and Gina left for Deadwood, John MacRae and Vince went into the study. John MacRae lit up a cigar and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He offered Vince a drink. Vince shook his head no and said, "What's this all about, Grandfather? What's the bad news?" John MacRae bit his lip and then took a swig of whiskey and then said, "Vincent, I want to prepare yourself with some very shocking news. Your Aunt Annie is your mother, and she is dying." Vince was visibly shaken and said, "What?" John MacRae proceeded to tell his grandson the complete story of his mother and his father. He told Vince of Annie and Carlo's relationship, of Carlo murdering his son and Annie's brother, of Annie killing Carlo, and of Annie's refusal to acknowledge her own son. After Carlo's death, Annie was never the same. She blamed herself for her brother's death and immersed herself in running the cigar business. Annie never married. John MacRae said his daughter was dying and wanted to see her son before she passed. While Vince was listening to his grandfather tell the story of his mother, he poured himself a glass of whiskey. Vince took several swigs. When John MacRae was finished, Vince said, "I don't know if I want to see her. What good would it do? And you, Grandfather, you lied to me all these years. I'm really a bastard." John MacRae slammed his fist on a desktop and loudly said, "You are a MacRae, and don't forget that. Your mother did what she thought was right. I might have done the same. Vince, I've lost a daughter and a son. Now I'm going to lose another daughter. You are all I have left. I don't want to lose you too. Please see your mother. She has suffered enough. Let her die in peace." Vince quietly said, "All right, grandfather, I'll see him, but I can't promise anything beyond just meeting her." 2 days later, John, Molly, and Vince MacRae, along with Gina Rosanna, were on a train bound for Chicago. During the train ride, Vince told Gina that his aunt was dying. He did not tell Gina that Annie was his mother. John and Molly MacRae appeared to be preoccupied and said very little during the train ride to Chicago. The train arrived at Chicago's Union Station in the late afternoon and would depart for Milwaukee within 1/2 hour. Vince left the coach with Gina. They sat together on a nearby bench, holding hands, and said their goodbyes. Vince promised to stop in Chicago on the return trip to South Dakota and spend time with Gina. Soon a loudspeaker loudly announced, "All aboard for Milwaukee and Green Bay." Vince and Gina embraced and engaged in a lingering, passionate kiss. Molly was watching Vince and Gina through the coach window. She smiled at her husband and said, "We may get to see some great-grandchildren someday." John MacRae forced a smile but did not respond. The train arrived in Milwaukee during the early evening. John MacRae immediately phoned Annie at her Lake Drive home. He wanted to visit her before doing anything else. Annie said, "I'm very tired, Father. Why don't you stop by tomorrow morning? Afterwards, we can all go to the cigar factory." "Is Vincent with you?" "Yes, he is. You want me to bring him with me tomorrow morning?" said John MacRae. "Please do," said Annie. John, Molly, and Vince MacRae had a late dinner at the Pfister Hotel. There was little conversation during the meal. The next morning, John, Molly, and Vince MacRae took a taxi to Annie's home on Milwaukee's Lake Drive. It was a gray stone Tudor located on the east side of Lake Drive. A nurse in a gingham uniform answered the door. John MacRae noticed a wheelchair in the foyer and gave a deep sigh. He turned to the nurse and said, "I'm Annie's father. Could you please tell me how she's doing?" The nurse said quietly, "All I can tell you is that Miss MacRae has taken a turn for the worse in the past month. Her doctor can give you the details." The nurse led the MacRaes into a large parlor. Annie was seated in a large leather-padded wheelchair. She was looking through a large picture window. Annie was watching the waves from Lake Michigan softly roll up onto the shore. The nurse said, "Miss MacRae, your family has arrived." The nurse gently turned the wheelchair around. John and Molly were shocked to see that Annie had aged well beyond her years. Her once dark hair was almost pure white. They both tried not to show their surprise at Annie's appearance. Holding back tears, Molly said, "Hello, Annie." Annie said softly, "Hello, Mother. Hello, Father." John and Molly MacRae both embraced their daughter for almost a full minute, then kissed her. Annie looked at Vince and said, "And this must be Vincent." She held out her hands. Vince was speechless and at a total loss for words. He finally said hello and then shook Annie's hand. Vince did not hug or kiss his mother. With tears in her eyes, Annie said, "How are you, my son?" Vince looked at the frail and helpless woman sitting before him. He thought of his grandfather's words, "Your mother did what she thought was right. I might have done the same." Suddenly, all of the feelings of resentment he had for his mother vanished in an instant. Vincent bent down and embraced his mother. With a tear in his eye, Vince said, "I'm just fine, Mother." Annie wiped her tears and said, "Oh, Vincent, I don't know where to start. I did you a terrible wrong. I want to—" Vince interrupted Annie and said, "You don't have to say anything, Mother. Grandpa told me the whole story about my Uncle Vincent and my father." The MacRaes all conversed for a while, then Annie said, "Let's all go visit the factory." John MacRae said, "Are you up to it, Annie?" Annie smiled and said, "Yes, Father. I still go in every day. My nurse goes in with me." John MacRae noticed the telephone on the end table and said, "I'll call a taxi." "That won't be necessary, Father. There's a car in the garage that will hold all of us. The keys are in this drawer," said Annie. Vince MacRae drove the MacRae family over to the cigar factory in Annie's 1940 Cadillac Fleetwood sedan. Annie spent some time bringing her father up to date on the company's financial condition. Then Annie smiled and she said, "Let me give you all a tour." Vince took charge of pushing Annie's wheelchair. The first floor held cigar manufacturing along with the shipping and receiving department. Annie told the MacRaes that cigar sales diminished after World War II. Annie said, "It seems like cigarettes have taken over. Even though cigar sales are lower, this part of the business still remains in the black, thanks to your Uncle Vincent's innovations." "Let's go to the second floor," said Annie. The second and third floors held the sewing operations. Both floors were filled with sewing machines and cutting tables. A design department was on one end of the third floor. Annie smiled and said, "This is now the heart of the MacRae business. Our line of police and firemen uniforms really took off after the war ended. We may have to move to a larger building." Throughout the tour, Vincent listened keenly to Annie's words. John MacRae listened to his daughter's words with sadness. After the tour was finished, Annie said, "I want you all to come over to my house this evening for dinner. Don't worry, it won't be me cooking. I'll get one of the chefs from Carl's to make the dinner." On the way back to the Pfister Hotel, John MacRae stopped at the office of Annie's doctor. John, Molly, and Vince MacRae listened closely as Annie's doctor told him of her condition. She was diagnosed 9 months ago with CJD. The doctor said normally the patient will have at least a year after being diagnosed. Annie now has but just a few weeks left. Molly started crying. John MacRae gave a sad sigh. Vince bowed his head and stared at the floor. That evening, the MacRae family had dinner at Annie's home on Lake Drive. Despite Annie's condition, the dinner was a somewhat joyful reunion of the family MacRae. There was a lot of reminiscing about Vincent and the cigar factory. John MacRae told the story of White Eagle. When he started to tell how he met his wife, Molly kicked her husband's ankle. He cut the story short. Vincent was unusually silent throughout the dinner. He finally spoke and said, "What's going to happen to the business?" Annie and Molly were startled by Vincent's remark. John MacRae frowned and curtly said, "Don't worry about it. Everything has been taken care of. Now is not the time to discuss this." Vincent glanced at his grandfather, then looked away. He lit a cigarette and said nothing. John MacRae changed the subject. He turned to Annie and said, "I see you still have that Rolls Royce." "I've been offered a small fortune for it. I just couldn't sell it. It still runs. I want Vince to have it," said Annie. As the MacRaes were getting ready to leave, Vince looked at Annie and said, "Mother, would you mind if I stayed here overnight? I'd like to spend some time with you. I could sleep on a couch." Molly tugged on Vince's coat sleeve and said, "Vince, you come back to the hotel with us. It's been a long day and your mother is tired. You can come back here tomorrow." Annie tried to stand up and said, No, Mother. I'll be just fine. I'd love to have my son stay over. Vince, I have a nice guest room." John and Molly MacRae drove back to the Pfister Hotel in the 1940 Cadillac. Molly looked at her husband and said, "I see you didn't tell Vince that you will be selling the business." Just then a drunk staggered into the street, and John MacRae braked and swerved to avoid hitting him. He angrily said, "Son of a bitch, I almost hit him. No, I didn't tell Vince. I don't want another MacRae in that damn business. I should have listened to you a long time ago and sold it. It costs a son and a daughter. I don't want to lose Vince. He's all we have." Molly said nothing. As Vince was Wheeling Annie out of the dining room, he said, "Are you tired, Mother? Would you like to go to bed now?" Annie smiled and said, "I'm fine, Vincent. Let's go into the parlor. Would you please pour me a bit of sherry? Help yourself to whatever you like." Vince poured a glass of sherry for Annie and scotch for himself. Annie tearfully told Vince about Carlo and how they met. She said she was starting to fall in love with Carlo until she found out that Carlo killed her brother. Annie went no further with the story, but she did say that she felt responsible for her brother's death. Annie told Vince she regretted not being a mother to him. As Vince listened to his mother's story, he was sympathetic of the tragedy she had to endure. Annie reminisced about her days in the fashion industry. Suddenly, Vince looked at Annie and said, "Mother, what's going to happen to the business?" Annie was startled by the question and said, "Didn't your grandfather tell you we're going to sell it?" Vince's voice took on a serious tone. He said, "Mother, I'd like to run the business." Annie sighed and said, "You will have to discuss this with your grandfather. I don't think he will permit it." "Oh, Vincent, how I wish I could turn the clock back." Annie's eyes began to tear up. The next morning, Annie and Vince had breakfast together. Vince told his mother that he was going to talk to his grandfather about running the MacRae family business. He asked the nurse to please call him a taxi. Annie smiled and said, "Vincent, take the Rolls Royce. It will start. I have a neighbor start it once a week and drive it. He wants to buy it from me, but it's yours now. The keys are in the desk drawer." Vince drove back to the Pfister Hotel on Lincoln Memorial Drive. He stopped for a minute to see Lake Michigan's waves roll onto the shores of Bradford Beach. Vince thought of his mother and teared up. He became more determined than ever to run the MacRae family business for her. John and Molly MacRae were eating breakfast in the Pfister Hotel's dining room. Vince joined them and immediately broached the subject of running the family business. John MacRae was irritated at the suggestion and loudly said, "No, I forbid it. It's out of the question." Molly looked at her husband and said, "Shh, people are looking at us." Vince calmly said, "Why is it out of the question, grandfather?" John MacRae said, "Why in God's name would you want to run a business you know nothing about?" "Because I'm a MacRae," said Vince with a sly grin. In the back of his mind, he knew this would be the perfect opportunity to be close to Gino Rosano. John MacRae recalled telling Vince that he was a MacRae. He sighed and said, "I'll need more than that, grandson. This cursed business has already cost me a son and a daughter. I don't want to lose you." "Grandfather, I know the terrible burden my mother has carried through the years. I understand why she did what she did. She told me last night that she wished she could have turned the clock back. I want her to die in peace." John MacRae was momentarily at a loss for words. He finally said, "Let me think about this." Later on, when John and Molly MacRae were alone, Molly said, "I hope you're not going to let our grandson get involved with the business." John MacRae shook his head from side to side and said, "I don't know what the hell to do. The kid does have a point. Annie has not had a good life. Maybe this will give her some peace. The kid certainly has the ability to run a business." Molly sighed. That evening, Vince phoned Gina Rosano. He told her that his Aunt Annie was actually his mother. Vince went on to tell Gina that he would be moving to Milwaukee to run the family business. Vince said, "When can I see you? We have a lot to discuss." Gina said, "Soon, I hope. I miss you." Vince said, "I love you, Gina." "I love you too," said Gina. Vince spent the next week learning the cigar and uniform business. Vince was impressed with his mother's overall business expertise and his grandfather's knowledge of cigar manufacturing. With his education and experience, Vince easily learned the intricacies of cigar and uniform manufacturing. One morning at breakfast, John MacRae said, "Vince, why don't you send a wire to the Homestake Mine and give them your notice? I see no reason for you to go back to South Dakota. When I get home, I'll give them the reason why you had to leave so abruptly." Vince said, "Sounds good, Grandfather. Would you mind if I went to Chicago for a few days? I want to see Gina. There's a train that goes there every day." "Take the Cadillac. It's an easy drive," said John MacRae with a grin. When John and Molly MacRae were alone, John said, "Other than saying he's a MacRae, I think there's another reason Vince wants to run the business. Might be that cute little Italian girl who lives in Chicago." Molly smiled and says, "You might be right, but so what? We should let things stay as they are. Annie seems to be at peace with herself, and I'm sure Vince and Gina will be very happy together." The next morning, Vince drove the Cadillac to Chicago's near west side, also known as Little Italy. Gina's parents lived in a brown brick bungalow just off of Taylor Street. Gina met Vince in a screened front porch. They embraced and kissed. Gina's mother was peeking through the curtains. She turned to her husband and said, "Oh my, what a handsome young man." Vito said nothing. Gina introduced Vince to her parents. Vito nodded at Vince but did not shake hands. Gina's mother said, "I hope you can stay for dinner, young man." Gina tugged on Vince's arm and said, "Vince will be staying with us for the next couple of days. He can use the guest room." Vito sighed softly. Gina frowned at her father. During dinner, Vince told Gina's parents of his moving to Milwaukee to run the family business. When Vince mentioned his working at the Homestake Mine, Vito said, "I used to work in a sulfur mine in Sicily." The mention of a mine broke the ice, and Vito proceeded to tell Vince about the working conditions he had to endure. Vince told Vito of the safety regulations now in place to protect the mine workers in the United States. After dinner, Vito and Vince smoked cigars and had a glass of anisette together. They continued their conversations about the mining industry. Vito mentioned that he was a retired cop. Vince told Vito stories of his grandfather. Later that evening, Gina and Vince went into the screened front porch and sat together at a wicker love seat. Vito said to his wife, "Now don't go peeking through that window again. You know, I kind of like that Vince guy. He's okay in my book." Vince said, "I was worried that your father wouldn't approve of me." Gina laughed and said, "Oh, he likes you, I can tell. He doesn't drink anisette with just anyone. Dad used to be a policeman, and he has a suspicious nature." Vince held Gina's hand and said, "I'm not going to beat around the bush. I know you are concerned about living in South Dakota. We can live together in Milwaukee. Gina, I love you with all my heart. Will you marry me?" Gina's blue eyes lit up and she said, "Yes, Vince, but we will have to wait until my tour of duty is up. It's only for 3 months." Vince embraced Gina and said, "I'd wait 100 years for you, my dear." Vince returned to Milwaukee to learn the cigar and uniform business. Gina reported to her unit at the Great Lakes Naval Station and told her commanding officer that she would not be re-enlisting. Annie and John MacRae spent the next weeks helping Vince learn the ins and outs of the cigar and uniform business. With his education and work experience, Vince proved to be an adept pupil. Annie grew weaker each day. During the 3rd week, Annie's condition worsened and she became bedridden. John and Molly MacRae sensed the end was near for their daughter. During the day, John and Vince would spend their days at the factory. Molly would remain with her daughter. Annie told Molly how happy she was that her son was going to carry on the business. Vince would spend his evenings with his mother. Annie grew weaker each day. One evening after Vince noticed Annie was laboring to breathe, Annie's doctor was summoned. After attending to Annie, the doctor told John MacRae that there was nothing more that could be done. It would be a matter of hours. Later that evening, with the MacRae family gathered around her bedside, Annie opened her eyes. With a faint smile, she softly said, "Oh, Mother, oh, Father, oh, my Vincent." Vincent held Annie's hand. Annie closed her eyes and passed away peacefully. After the funeral, Annie was interred at Forest Home Cemetery next to her brother and grandparents. On November 7th, 1945, Vincent MacRae married Gina Rosano at Our Lady of Pompeii Church in Chicago. After a brief honeymoon at Cape Cod, they settled in Annie's gray stone Tudor on Milwaukee's Lake Drive. Vince immersed himself in running the family business. He found the manufacturing of uniforms much more interesting than making cigars. He became interested in plastics and developed a line of lightweight vinyl raincoats. Vince went on to develop a line of inflatable products, including life preservers. When plastic buttons became scarce, he bought an injection molding press and manufactured the buttons himself. With his growing expertise in plastics, Vince began to manufacture medical products. He loved his work and the challenges of creating new product lines. He developed a line of ID bracelets using high-frequency welding machinery. Gina worked part-time as a volunteer nurse, along with doing sketching and painting in her spare time. One evening at dinner, Vince mentioned that the person in charge of fashion design was retiring next year. Gina was reluctant to ask her husband if she could take over the design department. She knew what Vince's answer would be. Gina finally broached the subject with Vince. She was surprised and pleased with his answer. Vince smiled and said, "Why, that's a great idea, my dear. Betty will be with us for at least 6 more months. You'll have plenty of time to take some design courses right here at the Layton School of Art. Best of all, my grandmother can work with you. You've seen her store in Deadwood." Gina got up and gave Vince a lingering kiss and then said, "Thank you, sweetie." A big grin appeared on Vince's face. He said, "Let's go upstairs." Gina held Vince's hand and said, "Okay, but first I've got something to tell you." Vince looked concerned and said, "What is it?" Gina smiled and said, "Sergeant MacRae, you are going to be a father." Life was good for Vince and Gina MacRae.